October 14, 1943. 30,000 feet above Schweinfurt, Germany. Staff Sergeant Eddie Kowalski sat behind the .50 caliber machine gun in the waist position of his B-17 Flying Fortress. Through the plexiglass window, he could see German FW-190 fighters diving toward his bomber formation. The fighters were coming in fast, over 300 miles per hour, crossing from right to left in a blur of motion. Eddie had trained for this moment. 6 weeks of gunnery school. Hundreds of rounds fired at stationary targets and slow-moving towed sleeves. He knew his weapon. He knew the manual. He was ready. The lead FW-190 opened fire. Tracer rounds streaked past Eddie's position. He swung his gun to track the fighter, pressed the trigger, and watched his own tracers arc through the sky. Direct line to the target. Exactly where the fighter was, and every single round missed. The fighter flashed past, untouched, and Eddie's ammunition counter showed he'd just burned through 50 rounds without landing a single hit. 2 minutes later, the same fighter made another pass. Eddie tracked it perfectly again, fired another burst. Another complete miss. The fighter's cannon fire hit the B-17's No. 3 engine, which began trailing smoke. By the time the raid was over, Eddie had fired over 800 rounds. He was certain he'd tracked multiple German fighters perfectly. His tracers looked like they were going right at the targets. But his bomber had taken heavy damage. 2 crew members were wounded, and he was fairly sure he hadn't hit a single enemy aircraft. He wasn't alone. That day, the 8th Air Force lost 77 bombers over Schweinfurt and Regensburg, over 25% of the attacking force. American gunners fired hundreds of thousands of rounds in defense, and post-war analysis would reveal that their actual hit rate against crossing German fighters was approximately 4%. 4%. That's 1 bullet in 25 actually hitting the target, despite tens of thousands of rounds fired, despite brave men doing exactly what they'd been trained to do, despite perfect mechanical function of their weapons. The problem wasn't courage. It wasn't training. It wasn't equipment failure. The problem was that human beings were being asked to do something that the human brain isn't naturally wired to do. Predict where a target moving at hundreds of miles per hour will be in the fraction of a second it takes a bullet to reach that point. The problem was deflection shooting, and solving it would require understanding why human instinct fails at this specific task, developing training methods that worked with human psychology instead of against it, and eventually creating technology that could do the mathematics faster than any human brain. If you want to understand why this physics problem killed thousands of Allied airmen and how they finally solved it, hit that subscribe button right now. This is one of the most fascinating technical challenges of World War II that most people have never heard about. And drop a comment on whether you think you could have solved this problem, because the answer might surprise you. Let me explain exactly why deflection shooting is so difficult. The trained gunners had a 96% miss rate, because once you understand the physics, you'll realize that human instinct is actually working against accuracy in this specific scenario. Imagine you're throwing a ball to someone running across a field. You don't throw it at where they are. You throw it at where they're going to be when the ball arrives. Your brain does this calculation automatically. You've been doing it since childhood. It's intuitive. Now, imagine the person is running at 300 miles per hour instead of 10. And instead of throwing a ball that takes 1 second to arrive, you're firing a bullet that takes 0.31 seconds to travel 300 yards. And the person isn't running in a straight line. They're changing altitude and angle as they approach. And you have about 2 seconds to make the shot before they're past you. That's aerial deflection shooting. And it breaks human intuition in specific, predictable ways. Here are the physics. A .50 caliber M2 Browning machine gun, the standard defensive armament on U.S. bombers, fires bullets at approximately 2,900 feet per second muzzle velocity. That sounds incredibly fast, but at 300 yards, 900 feet, accounting for air resistance, the bullet takes approximately 0.31 seconds to reach the target. Now consider the target. An FW-190 fighter attacking at 300 miles per hour is moving at 440 feet per second. In the 0.31 seconds it takes your bullet to travel to where the fighter was when you fired, the fighter has moved 136 feet, about 8 fighter lengths. This means you need to aim not at the fighter, but at a point 136 feet ahead of where the fighter currently is. You need to lead the target by roughly 15 to 20 feet in your sight picture, depending on the angle of approach. But here's why human instinct fails. When you track a moving target with your eyes, your brain wants to point the weapon at the target. It's the same instinct that helps you catch a ball or hit a baseball. Your visual cortex says, that's where the target is. Point the gun there. Except in deflection shooting, pointing the gun at the target guarantees a miss. You have to consciously override your instinct, calculate the lead, and aim at empty air ahead of the target, while the target is shooting at you, while your bomber is being hit, while your friends are dying around you, while adrenaline is flooding your system and triggering every survival instinct to focus on the immediate threat, which your brain interprets as the fighter you can see, not the empty space ahead of it. This isn't just difficult. This is asking the human brain to do something it's evolutionarily unprepared for. Comment below if you're starting to understand why even trained gunners had a 96% miss rate, and keep watching because the solution they developed is absolutely brilliant. The U.S. Army Air Force understood that deflection shooting was difficult. Their training manuals from 1942-1943 dedicated entire chapters to the concept. Instructors explained the physics. They drew diagrams showing the required lead at different angles and speeds. They told students, don't aim at the target. Aim ahead of the target. But there's a massive difference between understanding a concept intellectually and executing it under pressure, especially when your instincts are screaming at you to do the opposite. The standard gunnery training in 1942, early 1943 went like this. Student gunners would spend a few days in classroom instruction learning weapon mechanics and basic ballistics. Then they'd move to the range for live-fire training. The training targets were either completely stationary, mounted boards or towed banners that barely moved, or towed sleeves pulled behind aircraft at relatively slow speeds in predictable patterns. The problem was that none of this replicated actual combat conditions. A stationary target doesn't require deflection. A slow-moving towed sleeve requires minimal deflection, and a target moving in a predictable pattern allows you to set up your lead well in advance. Actual combat was nothing like training. German fighters didn't approach slowly in straight lines. They dove at high speed from above, crossed quickly at extreme angles, and were past the bomber before gunners could process what had happened. The deflection required was enormous. The target exposure time was minimal, and the pressure was maximal. So gunners arrived at their first combat mission having intellectually understood deflection, but having never actually practiced it under realistic conditions. And when the moment came, when actual German fighters made actual high-speed crossing attacks, gunners did what human instinct demanded. They aimed directly at the visible target and missed, again and again and again. If this deep dive into why training failed is opening your eyes to how complex aerial combat really was, hit that like button right now. Make sure you're subscribed because we're about to reveal how combat gunners themselves, not the training schools, figured out the solution through brutal trial and error. And drop a comment on what you would have done differently if you were designing the training program. The statistics were horrifying. In early 1943, the 8th Air Force, the primary U.S. bomber command in Europe, was losing an average of 6 to 8% of aircraft per mission. On particularly bad days like Schweinfurt Regensburg, August 17, 1943, or the Second Schweinfurt Raid, October 14, 1943, losses exceeded 22 to 25%. These weren't sustainable rates. At this pace, bomber crews had virtually no chance of surviving their required 25-mission tour. And the tragic irony was that the bombers were heavily armed. A B-17 Flying Fortress carried up to 1350 caliber machine guns. A formation of bombers could theoretically put up a defensive fire zone that no fighter could penetrate. On paper, the defensive armament should have been devastatingly effective. But paper doesn't account for human psychology, doesn't account for the fact that human brains, faced with a target moving at 300 mph, will instinctively aim at the target rather than ahead of it, doesn't account for the 0.31 seconds it takes a bullet to travel 300 yards, doesn't account for the 136 feet that target moves during that 0.31 seconds. The result was thousands of bombers shot down, tens of thousands of crewmen killed or captured, and defensive gunners who were doing exactly what felt right, exactly what their training had prepared them for, and achieving a 4% hit rate that made their weapons nearly useless. Understanding why training failed is critical to understanding how they finally fixed it. And the first breakthrough didn't come from training schools or technical experts. It came from combat gunners themselves who were trying desperately not to die. Staff Sergeant William Fleming, a waist gunner on a B-17 flying out of England in 1943, survived his first 5 missions without scoring a confirmed hit on any German fighter. His bomber was damaged repeatedly. Men in his crew were wounded, and Fleming knew that his defensive fire wasn't working. After his 5th mission, Fleming did something that would seem obvious in retrospect but was revolutionary at the time. He started keeping a notebook. Every mission, he'd write down what he did, how the German fighters attacked, where he aimed, and what happened. He was treating aerial gunnery like a science experiment, collecting data on his own performance. The pattern that emerged was clear. When he aimed directly at German fighters, he missed. Always. When he aimed ahead of them, trying to follow the manual's advice about deflection, he sometimes got hits, but inconsistently. He couldn't reliably judge how much to lead, so Fleming started using a different reference system. Instead of trying to calculate angles and speeds, he used the attacking fighter itself as a measuring tool. And WWII is about 29 feet long. If it's crossing at 300 yards distance at roughly 90 degrees, and you need to lead it by about 136 feet, that's roughly 4 to 5 fighter lengths. Fleming started using fighter lengths as his deflection guide. Crossing attack, roughly perpendicular, lead by 4 fighter lengths. Quartering attack at a shallower angle, lead by 2 fighter lengths. Head-on or tail attack with minimal deflection. Aim directly at the target. This was crude. It wasn't scientific. It didn't account for all variables. But it gave Fleming something his brain could work with, a visual reference that didn't require mathematics in the middle of combat. His hit rate doubled, then tripled. By his 10th mission, Fleming had 3 confirmed kills and multiple probable hits. His technique was working, and crucially, Fleming started teaching it to other gunners in his squadron. Not through official channels or training manuals, but through informal conversations. Hey, you know what works? Don't aim at the fighter. Aim at where the fighter is going to be. Use fighter lengths as your guide. This kind of informal knowledge, sharing, combat veterans passing, empirical techniques to newer crew members, was happening across the 8th Air Force. Gunners who survived long enough to develop these instinctive deflection habits were dramatically more effective than those still following the book. But it was haphazard. Some units developed these techniques. Others didn't. And the official training pipeline wasn't incorporating these lessons fast enough. This grassroots innovation by combat gunners is one of the great untold stories of WWII. If you're appreciating these human stories of innovation under pressure, make sure you're subscribed and have notifications turned on. Comment below on what solution you would have developed if you were facing this problem. And share this video because these stories of American ingenuity deserve to be widely known. By mid-1943, U.S. Army Air Force leadership was finally recognizing that they had a systemic gunnery problem. The loss rates were unsustainable. German fighter tactics were evolving to exploit American defensive weaknesses, and the psychological toll on bomber crews, watching their defensive fire prove ineffective mission after mission, was severe. General Ira Eaker, commander of the 8th Air Force, ordered a comprehensive review of aerial gunnery training and doctrine. Teams of instructors, combat veterans, and ballistics experts were assembled to figure out why actual combat results were so much worse than training had predicted. The findings were damning. The existing training program was producing gunners who understood deflection intellectually but couldn't execute it under combat conditions. The solution wasn't more classroom time explaining the physics. It was training that actually replicated the cognitive and psychological demands of combat. In late 1943, the Army Air Force began implementing major changes to gunnery training. The program length was extended from 6 weeks to 10 weeks. The number of live-fire practice rounds per student was increased from about 1,000 to over 5,000. And critically, the training targets changed. Instead of stationary boards and slow-toed sleeves, new training methods used high-speed targets that simulated actual fighter attacks. Some ranges used aircraft flying realistic attack patterns. Others used ground-based moving targets that required similar deflection calculations. The goal was to train gunners under conditions that activated the same instincts and pressures they'd face in combat, but the most important change was adopting the empirical, fighter-length system that combat veterans like Fleming had developed. Instead of trying to teach mathematical deflection calculation, instructors started teaching visual reference points. See that crossing fighter? Lead it by 3 plane lengths. See that quartering attack? Lead it by 1 plane length. Head on? Aim directly at the nose. This approach worked with human psychology instead of against it. It gave gunners something concrete to aim at, a visual reference, rather than asking them to calculate abstract angles while under fire. It turned deflection from a mathematics problem into a pattern recognition problem, which human brains are much better at solving. The results were dramatic. Gunners who completed the revised training program and learned the visual reference technique had hit rates 2 to 3 times higher than those trained under the old system. Combat reports from units that adopted these methods showed increased German fighter losses and decreased bomber casualties. But even with improved training, there was a limit to what human cognition could achieve. Deflection shooting would always be difficult because the fundamental problem, predicting, where a fast-moving target will be in the near future, requires constant calculation that human brains struggle with under pressure. What was needed wasn't just better training. What was needed was technology that could do the calculation for the gunner, technology that could measure the target's speed and direction, calculate the required lead, and automatically adjust the aiming point. That technology existed. It was called the computing Gunsight, and it was about to change aerial combat forever. We're at a critical turning point in this story, the moment when technology started solving problems that human training alone couldn't fix. Before we continue to the breakthrough technology, make sure you're subscribed because Part 2 will blow your mind with how a gyroscope solved a problem that had killed thousands. Hit that like button if you're fascinated by this combination of human psychology and physics. And comment your thoughts on whether technology should replace human skill, or if there's something valuable in keeping humans in the loop. The Mark 14 computing gunsight wasn't a new invention in 1943. The technology had existed since the 1930s. And British forces had been using similar gyroscopic sights since early in the war. But American adoption was slow, partly due to cost, partly due to manufacturing capacity, and partly due to military conservatism that assumed training could solve the deflection problem. By mid-1943, as bomber loss rates continued to climb despite improved training, the decision was made to prioritize production and installation of computing sites on American bombers and fighters. But explaining how these sites worked requires understanding what computing meant in a mechanical, pre-digital age. The Mark 14 was a gyroscopic sight. At its heart was a small gyroscope, a spinning wheel mounted on gimbals that maintained its orientation regardless of the aircraft's movement. This gyroscope was connected to a series of mechanical linkages that could detect how fast the gunner was rotating the sight to track a target. Here's the brilliant part. If you're tracking a target by moving your gun to keep the target in your sights, the rate at which you're rotating the gun reveals information about the target's angular velocity relative to you, And if you know the target's angular velocity and you estimate the range, you can calculate the required deflection. Mechanically, the sight incorporated a range estimation dial, adjusted by the gunner based on visual estimation of target size, and a wingspan dial, set based on the type of aircraft being engaged. With these inputs, the mechanical computer inside the sight would calculate the proper lead and display it to the gunner through a projected reticle that moved to show where to aim. Using the sight was dramatically simpler than manual deflection calculation. The gunner would set the range dial, estimated distance to target. 2. Set the wingspan dial, aircraft type. 3. Place the sight's reticle on the target and track it. 4. The sight would automatically calculate and display the proper lead point. 5. Fire. When the target appeared in the computed aiming point, the gunner no longer had to consciously calculate deflection. They just had to track the target and trust the sight to handle the mathematics. It turned deflection shooting from a conscious calculation into an instinctive tracking problem, something human brains are much better at. Field tests of the Mark 14 on bomber defensive positions showed immediate improvement. Hit rates against crossing targets jumped from 4 to 5% to 18 to 25% in optimal conditions, even accounting for combat stress, suboptimal conditions, and the learning curve of using new equipment. Actual combat hit rates with computing sights stabilized around 10–15%. Still not perfect, but 2 to 3 times better than manual deflection. This is the moment when technology solved a problem that training alone couldn't fix. If you're fascinated by how mechanical engineering solved complex physics problems before computers existed, you need to subscribe right now. Share this video with anyone interested in military history or engineering. And drop a comment on what other WWII technologies you want us to cover in future videos. The impact of computing sights extended beyond just hit rates. Psychologically, they gave gunners confidence. When you know your sight is calculating the deflection for you, you don't have the same moment of doubt. Am I leading enough? Too much? Is this going to work? That plagued gunners using manual deflection. Confidence translated to better performance, calmer decision-making under pressure, and better crew coordination. There's also a fascinating lesson here about human-machine collaboration. The Mark 14 didn't replace the gunner. It augmented human capability. The gunner still had to identify threats, prioritize targets, estimate range, track the target, and time the shot. The sight just handled the one cognitive task, deflection calculation, that human brains struggle with. This pattern of let humans do what humans are good at, let machines do what machines are good at, would become fundamental to military technology development. Modern fighter aircraft exemplify this. The pilot handles tactical decisions and situational awareness while computers handle flight control calculations that human reflexes can't keep up with. The Aegis combat system on Navy ships follows the same principle. Humans make engagement decisions while computers handle target tracking and weapon assignment. But even with computing sights and improved training, aerial gunnery remained dangerous and imperfect. German fighters continued evolving their tactics to minimize exposure time. The Luftwaffe developed high-speed slashing attacks, head-on runs, where deflection was minimal but closing speed was maximal, and standoff rocket attacks that allowed fighters to engage bombers from beyond defensive gun range. The arms race between offense and defense drove continuous innovation. Bombers added more guns in more positions. Gunners refined their techniques. Computing sights became more sophisticated. Training programs incorporated more realistic scenarios. Fighter escorts provided additional protection. Bombing doctrine evolved to minimize vulnerability. But the fundamental challenge, the physics of deflection shooting, remained. Every innovation was essentially a different approach to solving the same problem. How do you hit a target that's moving at hundreds of miles per hour when your weapon's projectile takes a fraction of a second to reach it? And the lesson that emerged from this evolution wasn't that one solution was perfect. It was that solving complex problems requires multiple approaches working together. better training that works with human psychology, technology that augments human capability, tactics that minimize vulnerability, and doctrine that incorporates lessons learned from actual combat experience. The lessons learned from WWII's Deflection shooting didn't end when the war did. In fact, they were just beginning. Because the fundamental problem, hitting a fast-moving target with a projectile that takes time to reach it, didn't disappear with the defeat of Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan. It evolved. Jet aircraft made the problem exponentially harder. A propeller-driven fighter at 300 meters required leading by about 136 feet at 300 yards. But early jet fighters flew at 500 to 600 meters. Modern jets can exceed 1/1500 meters. The deflection requirements scale proportionally. The faster the target, the further ahead you must aim. By the late 1940s, it was clear that manual deflection shooting, even with computing sights, was reaching its limits. Human reaction times couldn't keep up with jet speeds. The window of opportunity for a successful shot was shrinking, and the consequences of failure were becoming more severe as aircraft became more expensive and crews more difficult to train. The solution was to push further in the direction that the Mark 14 computing sight had pioneered. Take more of the targeting task away from human cognition and give it to machines. Not because humans were incompetent, but because the physics of the problem were moving beyond what human neurology could reliably handle. This led to the development of radar-guided fire control systems in the 1950s. Instead of a gunner visually tracking a target and a mechanical computer calculating deflection, radar could track the target automatically, and digital computers could calculate not just deflection, but also optimal firing solutions accounting for multiple variables: target speed, altitude, closing rate, ammunition ballistics, atmospheric conditions. The human's role shifted from doing the calculation to making the decision. Is this target hostile? Should we engage? Which weapon system should we use? The execution, the actual aiming and firing, became increasingly automated. This trend accelerated. Through the Cold War, surface-to-air missiles took over the anti-aircraft role from guns in many applications because missiles could course-correct in flight, eliminating the deflection problem entirely. The missile could adjust its trajectory to intercept the target, rather than requiring perfect prediction at the moment of firing. If you're seeing how the WWII deflection shooting problem evolved into modern weapons systems, make sure you're subscribed. This historical thread connects to technology you interact with today, even if you're not in the military. Drop a comment on whether you think full automation of targeting is a positive development, or whether humans should always be in the loop. Keep watching because the modern applications get even more fascinating. But guns didn't disappear entirely. They evolved. And one of the most direct descendants of WWII aerial gunnery research is the Phalanx Close-In Weapon System, CIWS, used by the U.S. Navy for last-ditch defense against incoming missiles and aircraft. The Phalanx is essentially the ultimate expression of the computing gunsight concept. It's a 6-barreled 20mm Gatling gun mounted on a rotating platform with integrated radar and computer fire control. The system can autonomously detect, track, and engage incoming threats at a rate of 4,500 rounds per minute. Here's the critical part. The Phalanx solves the deflection problem the same way the Mark 14 computing sight did, just with vastly more computational power and automation. Radar tracks the target. Computers calculate the required lead, accounting for target speed, wind, the ballistic properties of the ammunition, even the ship's movement. The gun automatically adjusts its aim and fires when the probability of a hit is highest. The human operator's role is to authorize the system to engage and monitor its performance. The actual deflection calculation and execution happen too fast for human involvement. When an anti-ship missile is approaching at supersonic speeds, there's no time for a human gunner to manually calculate. Lead. The Phalanx has to do it automatically. Or the ship gets hit. This is the direct lineage from Eddie Kowalski missing crossing FW. 190s in 1943 to modern autonomous defense systems protecting Navy carriers. Same physics problem. Same fundamental challenge of hitting a fast-moving target. Just evolved to handle threats moving at thousands of miles per hour instead of hundreds. And the lesson is the same. Human brains can't reliably do the math fast enough, so we build machines that can. But humans remain essential for the judgment calls that machines can't make. When to authorize force, how to prioritize threats, whether the situation even calls for engagement. The fighter aircraft that replaced the bombers Eddie Kowalski defended followed a similar evolution. Modern fighter radar doesn't just detect targets. It calculates firing solutions, recommends weapons, and in some cases can autonomously track and engage under pilot authorization. The F-35's sensor fusion and targeting systems are doing the same deflection calculations that the Mark 14 sight pioneered, just millions of times faster and with far more variables considered. This evolution from manual deflection to fully automated targeting is one of the most important technological progressions in military history. If you're fascinated by how WWII problems shaped modern technology, hit that like button and share this video. Subscribe for more deep dives into how historical challenges drove innovation. And comment on what other technologies you'd like us to trace from WWII to the present. The deflection shooting lessons didn't just influence defensive systems and missiles. They fundamentally changed how fighter pilots engaged enemy aircraft. In WWII, even fighter pilots struggled with deflection shooting. P-51 Mustang pilots attacking German fighters faced the same physics problem as bomber gunners, just from a different platform. Post-war analysis of WWII's fighter combat revealed that most kills happened in very specific circumstances. When the attacker was directly behind the target, zero deflection. When the target didn't know it was being attacked, or when the attacker was significantly more skilled than average. The majority of pilots who engaged in deflection, shooting, trying to hit crossing or maneuvering targets, missed most of their shots. This wasn't surprising given everything we know about deflection shooting difficulty. But it created a problem for air forces planning for future conflicts. If most pilots couldn't reliably hit maneuvering targets, air-to-air combat would become prohibitively expensive in terms of ammunition expenditure and missed opportunities. The Korean War, 1950-1953, provided the first test case for applying WWII deflection lessons to jet combat. American pilots flying F-86 Sabres against North Korean and Chinese MiG-15s faced deflection challenges that made WWII gunnery look simple. Jets flew faster, turned harder, and created deflection requirements that exceeded what even computing gunsights could reliably handle at the speeds involved. The solution that emerged in Korea was tactical rather than technological. American pilots developed tactics that minimized deflection requirements. Boom and zoom attacks from altitude advantage, tail chase engagements where possible, and coordinated team tactics where one pilot forced the enemy into a predictable maneuver that set up a zero deflection shot for his wingman. These tactics acknowledged that deflection shooting at jet speeds was unreliable, even for skilled pilots with computing sights. Rather than try to improve deflection shooting, the tactics aimed to create situations where deflection wasn't required. This is another expression of the same lesson from WWII. When human capability can't meet the task demands, change the task rather than demanding superhuman performance. The Korean War's tactical innovations show how the deflection problem continued evolving. If you're appreciating this continuous thread from WWII through Korea to modern combat, you need to subscribe right now. Hit that like button if you're learning history you didn't know, and comment on whether you think emphasizing tactics over marksmanship was the right approach. But as jets got even faster through the 1950s and 1960s, even tactical solutions to deflection became inadequate. The closing speeds in jet combat, sometimes exceeding 1,000 meter-interiors combined, meant that engagement windows measured in seconds. There simply wasn't time for traditional dogfighting and deflection shooting. This drove the development of air-to-air missiles as the primary fighter weapon. The AIM-9 Sidewinder, introduced in 1956, was revolutionary not just because it was a guided weapon, but because it solved the deflection problem in a fundamentally different way. The missile's infrared seeker could track the target's heat signature and guide itself to intercept. The pilot just had to get within range and achieve a launch position. The missile handled the deflection. Early Sidewinders weren't perfect. They required being almost directly behind the target to get a heat lock. They couldn't pull high-G turns to intercept maneuvering targets. They were easily fooled by sun glare or clouds, but they represented a paradigm shift. The weapon itself corrected for deflection rather than requiring the pilot to predict it at launch. As missile technology improved through the 1960s and 1970s, all-aspect heat seekers and radar-guided missiles made it possible to engage targets from almost any angle. The pilot's role shifted from deflection calculation to tactical positioning. Get the enemy into the missile's engagement envelope. Achieve a lock, launch, and let the missile handle the intercept. This seems like it would have made deflection shooting obsolete. But Vietnam War combat revealed an unexpected problem. Rules of engagement often required visual identification of targets before firing missiles, which meant getting close. And missiles, especially early ones, were unreliable. Failure rates exceeded 50% in some cases, which meant pilots often found themselves in close-range dogfights where they'd already expended their missiles and had to fall back on guns. And when they did, they discovered that a generation of pilots trained primarily for missile combat couldn't reliably hit targets with guns. The deflection shooting problem had returned, except now pilots were even less prepared for it than WWII gunners had been. The Vietnam War's rediscovery of gun combat's importance shows why old problems never fully disappear. Subscribe to see more examples of cyclical military challenges. Share this with anyone interested in how technology shapes tactics and vice versa. Comment on whether you think future pilots need gun training or whether missiles have truly made guns obsolete. This led directly to one of the most famous military training programs in history, the Navy Fighter Weapons School, better known as Top Gun. Established in 1969, Top Gun's mission was to improve Navy pilots' air combat effectiveness. And a significant part of that training focused on deflection shooting with guns. Top Gun instructors rediscovered and formalized many of the same lessons that WWII gunnery instructors had learned. Deflection shooting requires extensive, realistic practice under pressure. Visual reference techniques work better than abstract mathematical calculation. Technology, in this case advanced gunsights, helps, but only if pilots trust it and use it correctly. And most importantly, tactics that minimize deflection requirements, forcing the enemy into predictable maneuvers, achieving positional advantage, work better than trying to make impossible shots. The program's success vindicated the WWII era insight that training methodology matters as much as training content. Top Gun graduates showed dramatically better air combat performance not because they learned new information, but because they practiced realistic scenarios that developed instinctive responses to combat situations. The same principle that turned William Fleming from a struggling gunner into an ace. Repeated practice under conditions that approximate actual combat stress. Modern fighter aircraft continue to grapple with deflection challenges despite extraordinary technological advances. The F-22 Raptor and F-35 Lightning II have helmet-mounted displays that project targeting information directly onto the pilot's visor, sophisticated radar that tracks multiple targets simultaneously, and advanced gun systems with computerized fire control. But when a pilot engages with the cannon, they're still solving the same deflection problem Eddie Kowalski faced in 1943, just at higher speeds with better tools. The M61 Vulcan cannon on modern. U.S. fighters fire 6,000 rounds per minute, giving pilots a better chance of hitting with at least some rounds from a burst. The fire control computer calculates deflection based on radar-derived target data and displays a predicted impact point. But the pilot still has to achieve the right geometry, maintain the track, and pull the trigger at the right moment. Human judgment and machine calculation working together, exactly as the Mark 14 computing site pioneered. And the problem has expanded into new domains. Drone warfare, which has become increasingly important in 21st century conflicts, involves different deflection challenges. A Predator or Reaper drone operator sitting in a ground station in Nevada, controlling a drone over Afghanistan, faces a unique version of the deflection problem. The video feed has a slight time delay due to satellite communication. The drone itself has latency between control input and response, and the missile or bomb being released has ballistic properties that require prediction of target movement. During flight time, modern drone targeting systems solve this with computers that account for all these variables: communication lag, weapon ballistics, target motion, wind, altitude, and present the operator with a predicted impact point. But it's the same fundamental challenge. A weapon takes time to reach the target, so you must aim at where the target will be, not where it is. And the solution is the same. Let computers do the prediction while humans make the engagement decision. The deflection shooting problem has followed us from WWII bombers to modern drones, constantly evolving but never disappearing. If you're seeing this continuous thread, make sure you're subscribed for more historical deep dives that reveal timeless challenges. Like this video and share it with anyone in engineering, military studies, or technology development. Comment on what modern military technology you'd like us to trace back to its historical roots. But the deflection shooting legacy isn't just about guns. It fundamentally shaped how we think about predictive targeting in general. Guided missiles, which largely replaced guns for long-range anti-aircraft work, are themselves a solution to the deflection problem, just a different solution. Instead of calculating where the target will be and aiming there, missiles can adjust their flight path to intercept the target's future position. Early missiles did this mechanically through control surfaces and simple guidance systems. Modern missiles use sophisticated computers, GPS, inertial guidance, radar, infrared sensors, and active homing to pursue and intercept targets even if those targets maneuver unpredictably. The AIM-120 AMRAAM, Advanced Medium Range Air-to-Air Missile, for example, uses radar to continuously update its understanding of the target's position and trajectory. If the target maneuvers, the missile adjusts. This solves the deflection problem by eliminating the need for perfect prediction. The missile can course-correct based on real-time data. But even missiles face deflection-like challenges. The missile's own flight time creates a lag between where the target is when the missile's sensors detect it and where the target will be when the missile arrives. At longer ranges and higher speeds, this lag becomes significant. Missile guidance computers have to predict the target's future position just like a bomber gunner had to predict where an FW-190 would be. The difference is scale and speed. A WWII gunner was predicting 0.3 seconds into the future. A modern air-to-air missile might be predicting 30 seconds into the future while traveling at Mach 4. But it's the same fundamental physics problem. Your weapon takes time to reach the target, so you must aim at where the target will be, not where it is. And the solution is the same. Use sensors and computers to do the prediction, because human brains can't process the variables fast enough. Trust the technology to handle the mathematics, while humans handled the strategic decisions about when and whether to engage. This human-machine collaboration philosophy that emerged from WWII Gunnery problems now permeates modern military systems. Aegis radar systems on Navy cruisers track hundreds of targets simultaneously and present engagement recommendations to human operators. AWACS aircraft provide battlefield awareness that no human could maintain through manual observation. Drone operators make strike decisions while automated systems handle flight control. The pattern is universal. Let humans do what humans do best: judgment, ethics, strategic thinking. Let machines do what machines do best: rapid calculation, tracking multiple variables, executing with precision. Subscribe if this framework for thinking about human-machine collaboration interests you. Comment on whether you think there are tasks that should always remain fully human-controlled, or whether full automation is inevitable and beneficial. There's also a fascinating lesson here about training philosophy. Remember that the breakthrough in WWII gunnery came not from better explaining the physics, but from changing training to work with human psychology instead of against it. That lesson applies far beyond military aviation. Modern human factors. Engineering, the discipline of designing systems around human capabilities rather than expecting humans to adapt to poorly designed systems, owes a debt to WWII gunnery research. The realization that you can't simply train humans to overcome cognitive limitations, that you have to design both training and tools to accommodate how human brains actually work, revolutionized how we approach complex systems. Flight simulators, for example, don't just teach aircraft mechanics. They train muscle memory and pattern recognition under realistic stress conditions. This directly descends from the WWII realization that classroom physics lessons didn't translate to combat performance. You have to train the way you'll fight, replicating not just the tasks but the cognitive and psychological conditions. Virtual reality training for soldiers. Surgeons, pilots, and emergency responders follows the same principle. The goal isn't just to teach procedures intellectually, but to build intuitive responses that work under pressure when conscious thought becomes difficult. This is the modern descendant of William Fleming's fighter lengths system, giving people concrete visual references rather than abstract calculations. Even outside military applications, the lessons apply. User interface design, for instance, often succeeds or fails based on whether it works with human intuition or fights against it. The best software doesn't require users to learn complex procedures. It presents information and controls in ways that align with how people naturally think and perceive. The deflection shooting problem was ultimately a human factors problem disguised as a physics problem. The physics was understood from the beginning. The challenge was getting humans to reliably execute against those physics under combat stress. The solution wasn't better physics education, it was better training psychology and augmentative technology. This broader lesson about human factors engineering is why this WWII story matters today. The principles apply to everything from software design to medical procedures to crisis management. If you're seeing the universal applications, make sure you're subscribed for more historical deep dives that reveal timeless lessons. Share this with anyone in engineering, design, or training roles, and comment on what other historical problems you think shaped modern design principles. Let's bring this full circle to where we started. Eddie Kowalski in the waist of a B-17, watching his tracers miss crossing German fighters. The story of how that problem was solved, through empirical experimentation by combat gunners, improved training that worked with human psychology, and computing sites that augmented human capability, contains lessons that remain relevant 80 years later. First, complex problems often require multiple solutions working together. No single fix solved the deflection shooting problem. It required better training, visual reference techniques, computing sites, tactical changes, fighter escorts, and continuous adaptation. Modern military systems follow the same approach, layered solutions that address different aspects of the problem. Second, human limitations aren't failures. They're design constraints that systems must accommodate. Expecting gunners to calculate deflection while under fire was unrealistic. Accepting that limitation and designing around it, through visual reference training and computing sites, was what worked. Modern systems design follows this principle. Identify human cognitive limits and design tools that augment rather than fight those limits. Third, innovation often comes from users, not designers. The fighter lengths technique that dramatically improved hit rates wasn't invented by training schools or weapons developers. It was developed by combat gunners trying to survive. Modern military culture has institutionalized this lesson. Operational feedback loops that incorporate combat lessons into training and doctrine are now standard. Fourth, technology should augment human capability, not replace human judgment. The Mark 14 computing site didn't replace gunners. It handled the one task, deflection calculation, that humans couldn't do reliably while leaving humans to handle target identification, threat assessment, and engagement decisions. Modern autonomous systems follow this model. Automate execution while keeping humans in decision loops. And finally, understanding why something doesn't work is as important as making it work. The breakthrough in WWII gunnery came from understanding why human instinct failed at deflection shooting, not from simply demanding better performance. That diagnostic approach, understanding the root cause rather than just treating symptoms, is fundamental to effective problem-solving in any domain. These are timeless lessons from a specific WWII technical challenge. If this story has changed how you think about problem-solving, human-machine collaboration, or the historical roots of modern technology, make sure you're subscribed. Hit that like button and share this video because these lessons deserve a wider audience. Drop your final thoughts in the comments. What's the most important takeaway from this story for you? What other WWII technical challenges should we explore? Thank you for watching this deep dive into one of World War II's most fascinating and under-discussed problems. The deflection shooting challenge killed thousands before it was properly understood and addressed. But the solutions that emerged shaped military technology for generations and continue influencing how we design systems today. Check out our other videos for more stories about how historical challenges drove innovation. And remember, the best solutions don't fight against human nature. They work with it, augmenting human capability rather than trying to replace or override it. See you in the next video.